guess we're all excited to jump in. Um, should we wait just a few more minutes in case? Because I did tell people 110. Maybe just wait another few before we get into anything too juicy.
Talk about anything other than biophilosophy.
It's a soft warm up. It's been really good to just be together online for the last 2 days with you all. Most of the interesting thinking at conferences tends to happen outside of the talks. And so we obviously lose some of that, but maybe we can make up for it in the next, what do we have, like 90 minutes that we've set aside today. Uh,
Can I can I just say quickly that I've really appreciated like a fire hose experience of philosophical knowledge and wisdom. And you guys from down under you have some amazing coffee or cocaine, whatever it is. It's pretty amazing. Thank you for
Coffee.
all
Yeah.
that.
This is being recorded, so I'll have to say coffee, right?
I haven't tried Australian coffee beans yet. I guess I'm missing out.
It's not so much the beans. I mean, famous for the espresso
The
culture.
roast, yeah.
Yeah. Um, and Melbourne was, particularly famous, and then it's kind of spread all over Australia. And even when I go to Europe now and stuff, it's like the best cafes that I find, or at least the ones that I find the best, are run by Australians and New Zealanders. Very interesting. I've been unable to see. Hi, Catherine. I've been unable to see most of the talks to this point because of time zone issues, but I'm really looking forward to actually like catching up on the conference after the conference.
Mm-hmm.
Recording in progress.
Oops. Jack had a system meltdown. Well, let's just go ahead and get started. I mean, I just um, wanted to offer a few thoughts about convergences and potential conflicts that came up over the course of the many wonderful talks we heard about two particular issues. One would be, I think we heard it maybe most directly expressed earlier today with Terence Deacon's talk about AI and Michael Levin's talk about this sort of polycomputational approach to biological development, but also the spectrum of cognition that, from Mike Levin's point of view, thermostats have a kind of mind. And, human beings, Mike thinks, need to prepare themselves for the arrival through our own recognition of other kinds of minds that we aren't noticing yet. And he even wants to attribute agency to Platonic forms and patterns. Whereas, Terry Deacon was showing us how computation, at least as it's been understood in the sense of Turing machines, is very different from um, processes like biological development and embryogenesis, morphogenesis. And so is that a semantic issue or is that a deep conceptual issue? And one more issue that I think was interesting that has come up is individuality versus relationality, let's say. We heard about von Uexküll's Umwelt as a kind of enclosure, at least in terms of understanding it as a phenomenological horizon of subjective experience. There's an ethological Umwelt that Tim introduced us to. Tim Pfeiten introduced us to just before that might be slightly more relational. But in autopoiesis, you have this real focus on individual autonomy and that operational closure and information is only to be understood relative to an autopoietic being's Umwelt, you could say, to its domain of signification. Whereas Simondon would want to say, no, there is information that can cross that boundary, and that we can't talk about operational closure and then look at empirically study the biological world and see all these examples of lateral gene transfer and other sorts of mobile genetic elements where there seems to be that membrane boundary being penetrated. And, Donna Haraway comes up with this notion of sympoiesis and says nothing makes itself in the living world. And is that a challenge to autopoiesis or just a different understanding of what structural coupling might mean? And so, yeah, these two issues, the organic and the computational that came through in Terence Deacon and Mike Levin's talks today, and then this individuality and relationality question that came through in our discussion of von Uexküll, autopoiesis, Simondon. So those are just some of the ideas that were on my mind, but I welcome us to go in any direction we want to. Do you want to say something, Spyridon, about your sense of the last 2 days?
I think that we often use the term mechanism, but we did not make clear in what sense we were talking about mechanism. So this is, for example, Mike Levin talked today sometimes about mechanisms, but I did not understand what is his exact concept of mechanism. And I think that this is also important for understanding the relation of his ideas to those of Deacon. But I mean, about yesterday, I could say a few other things. Yeah. So, for example, the relation between vitalism and mechanism, it's actually a similar issue. And Timothy Jackson made us very clear yesterday that vitalism and mechanism are not always opposites. Or did I understand you wrong?
I think the point that Kungiem is making, that I was sort of paraphrasing, it was a point also made by a bunch of other people, but the vital is the generative there, the spontaneous, etc. And for Kungiem, there's none of that in the mechanical, right, in machines. So machines are essentially functioning as constraints, relays, mediators then of a generative, like, I'm trying not to say vital force, but obviously that is a term that is used. But I think that's the key distinction that he's making. Machines don't make anything themselves, mechanisms don't make anything themselves, but they are constraining. And I like to go to Simondon there, in the sense that the mechanisms are like structures that are the achievements of operations and that canalize ongoing operations. So the two things are very much part of the same kind of process. And so it's sort of a matter of emphasis whether we're looking at one or the other, perhaps. But yeah, I think that the key distinction that Kungiem is trying to make is between the generative and the sort of constraining, or yeah.
Okay.
I can chime in real quick about, Matt, your point about sort of what might be the difference between the sort of principles that Deacon is providing and Michael Levin. I think one thing Deacon emphasized, simulation of intelligence. I think one thing that we need to be careful of is if something looks intelligent, if something looks alive, it doesn't necessarily embody the principles of intelligence and what we mean by life. So that's one thing we have to be careful of, because simulation can be very powerful and convincing, but it doesn't mean it embodies the principles that we're looking for. And also, I would say, if I had to extract one important insight from how Terry sees differently, is that he thinks there's a difference between a system creating its own goals and boundary conditions and constraints. And what happens with machines and cybernetic systems and computers is that humans offload their goals onto the machine, and they operate within the goals that were externally set, whereas organisms have this intrinsic intrinsic mechanism or embody this principle of creating their own boundary conditions and goals. So I would say that's what Terry would say, the sort of fundamental differences. So but simulations don't necessarily have to create their own goals and boundary conditions.
Yeah. I think the difference between simulation and realization is so important here. And in terms of, I wanted to ask you actually, Parham, maybe I'll just throw this out now, that I've been seeing a lot of people who want to talk about this on social media, wanting to attribute not just mind or intelligence to their AI, to ChatGPT, particularly the one that speaks to you, the speech model that's increasingly, it even says and it does all these things that are ChatGPT, the OpenAI is trying to convince us that it is actually conscious, but people are falling for that. And ethically, I think if we're going to cancel the distinction between simulation and realization, which would be one interpretation of what Mike Levin is doing, it's kind of inviting people to begin to relate to their machines, their computers in that way as an actual soul, a person. People are going to start demanding rights for their instance of ChatGPT, So, I mean, what do you think about that? That's an ethical challenge to this ontological, seemingly abstract issue we're trying to resolve, simulation versus realization, but it has real consequences for our society.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think like being honest about that point is important. And it's concerning because like people who kind of invented these systems, like Hinton says that they're already conscious, they're already intelligent, we're already there, and that he's like the godfather of AI. And I think the complacency there and like not being humble about we don't understand the principles of life and intelligence yet, and to say that because this behaves a certain way, it definitely embodies all the principles we already know that are operative in life sciences. I think that's just lacks humility to me, and we should be cautious about that. And I think these systems are better modeled as catalysts of our creative processes. And trying to make them look like us, I think misses the point of what their role should be in society. And that's why I look into biology to be inspired about whether there is already a harmonious relationship between living beings and their compressed forms, which we argue these systems, LLM systems are. So yeah, I think trying to make them more human-like and convincing us that they're independent minds miss the mark about what organic role they might be playing for culture as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. So I guess the best way to do this, on Zoom is just to go through whose hands are up in order. So Alfredo, you're next, please.
Yeah, thank you. I understand the point of Parham, but as an anthropologist that studies multi-species design and technology, I mean, we are far too far off being careful. I mean, in Japan, people do funerals for able robots. People think in Shintoism that robots have life. So, I mean, humans are not careful. I mean, all the history of technology we project in machines or fears and ideas. So we are far to be careful about this. In technology, we project pareidolia. We see images, we see faces, we see emotions, and this will not end. I mean, so as an anthropologist, I am more interested in the relations about empathy between humans and species and technology, because I mean we cannot resolve this careful problem. I mean, we cannot be careful with this. I mean, it's beyond our capacity.
Yeah. No, we may just need to mitigate what the genie that's been let out of the bottle, but yeah. Farzad, please.
Wow. Yes. Wonderful, wonderful feast. So just to just pick up quickly, yeah, I do really agree with Deacon and Parham that this contribution to culture, organic contributions to culture, I guess with Michael Levin too, and some of it yesterday, it's getting all mixed together right now in my head, but I do agree that the mind, the cognitive space that we live in, which is full of mind in that sense, is part of the organic development of culture. And so LLMs simulating what we do, that distinction between simulation and reality is going to have to go, it's going to get submerged in all of the volume of stuff that's going to be generated, that is being generated. And so I'll give you one example of what where simulation and reality, it doesn't make a difference. One of them, just point to our politics of the day. I'll come back to that. But the other one is when machines start to blackmail their programmers, as they've been doing. These are tests they run to see how far they will go, right? So the programmers will run tests and then watch the behavior of the system. So there's a couple of stories of this out where in one of them, I think it was Claude, was threatening to reveal to the spouse of one of the programmers that he's having an affair if he continues to threaten to shut down the program. So these sort of simulating self-preservation, simulating deception, and simulating these other kinds of activities, simulating evil, still evil. In some way, you can say the line gets very thin there. So there's that. And then beyond that, I'm using LLMs and other computational things and everything to look at the history of alchemy, for example. Now, when you look at the history of pre-modern world, a lot of it is already fictional. It passes for scholarship, but I think, well, history of science, like Whitehead says, the history of ideas is a history of mistakes. Science is a self-correcting error generator. So humanity is even worse. So when we simulate what we think is the history of alchemy and how it worked out, we're doing it on small sources, just mostly European sources, and we're still, confabulating a lot. Now, if we get LLMs involved in that process of doing computational histories of science or politics or whatever, we will add to the fictional dimension. Some of it will go along disciplinary lines that people already agree, the best thinkers already agree. Some of it will not. And anyway, it gets me to thinking that as our AI are also spending a lot of time on academic sites and journals, sucking up information and also contributing back to it, we're getting to that somewhere in face space, there's going to be this big crap ball, like all of the stuff that gets stuck in. Anyway, so that's what I'm concerned about, and that will contribute to the culture. So I still think we're on track for a biosemiotic interpretation of artificial intelligence being part of our future organically. I just I don't know where to go with that. I wonder if there's any sort of definitely there must be some errors in that way of thinking, but I'm just looking for a sort of a better grasp on how LLM and biosemiotics might match that doesn't just continue to be some good, some bad, and some more.
Yeah, thanks, Farzad. I just want to say I think the history of alchemy is super important for the history of biophilosophy. So I'll have to have you contribute something on that for us soon.
Looking forward.
Jack, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably going to take us a little bit off of where we're currently talking, maybe connecting back to some of Tim's ideas and the space between the organic and the technical, and trying to, in a way, muddy the water, but also keep things separate and see multiple kind of modalities of mixture as well, I think is really important. I think that there can be like organic technicity, which isn't necessarily the same as like technical organisming or something like that. And I know that's like vague wordplay, but I think it's actually there's underlying stuff there. And even this idea of the generative versus constraint, I think, has a lot of problematic tensions. But I also want to say we should keep these things separate while also entertaining all of the problematic interactions. Like there can be generative constraints, of course, and we can also constrain generativity for good and bad things, right? And I think when we get to the question of the other and subjectivity is when this becomes perhaps the trickiest. How do we say there is absolute alterity and like the infinite that comes with that, according to Levinas, but also, and like the closure versus openness there, and also at the same time affirm with Merleau-Ponty, for example, that there is porosity between our subjectivities. And I think we can do these things. Like, I don't think we're going to completely sacrifice the otherness of the other and the sort of sacred and moral imperative that creates in our lives, by admitting that there's this middle ground. And I think that the idea, just really quick, of like instrumentality and the middle voice is really important, like a self-instrumentalization and Tim said this really well, that, actually both Tims, but that there's a openness to transformation within the tool, that it's never fully determined in what it is. Like, we don't yet know what a body can do, according to Spinoza. We don't yet know how tools can be instrumentalized, and how we can instrumentalize differently, I guess. Anyway, just throwing that in the mix. And there's a way to connect that all to the AI as well. I mean, I think even thinking about, just to problematize a little bit, I think Alfredo was before me. I don't remember exactly, but or who was right before me? Oh, okay, Farzad. Farzad. Sorry.
Yeah, you got me.
Okay. That, if there's a good outcome with our interactions with AI, that it's purely like organic, or that we should think about it only in organic terms, that there could also be a kind of, and I totally agree that that's probably the right way to start thinking about it. But there's also a sense in which the instrumentality and the technicity of it is organically and concretely evolving as well in positive ways. Anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Just quickly on the question that Tim Feiton was exploring around the ethics of a closed Umwelt versus an open Umwelt, and whether intersubjectivity is real. I mean, I think it's, I kept thinking of Catherine's presentation on emotion and how that's the bridge that connects us when we're in an empathic resonance with each other. That's real intersubjectivity, and there's a perforation or a overlap of our Umwelts in that case. And so it's like, I think Mike Levin's work helps us here, actually, in recognizing how, cells with different charges, as soon as they touch, they equalize the charge. We can be not in resonance with and be really closed in our own Umwelt. I mean, it happens a lot. But we can also break into a shared Umwelt with others, whether through a literally bioelectric charge or an EM field or just emotional resonance.
I will say that that never ends the bad conscience of having to wonder if we're dominating or
Sure.
overthinking the other or something like that. And I think
Yeah,
that
I mean,
Spinoza. Oh,
hovers.
sorry.
Yeah, Sartre is hovering. Like, I don't want to go as far as other people, but
exactly. Well, let me say really quick, Spinoza, I think, has a good answer to that, because we couldn't have adequate knowledge of each other, which means that we would literally be each other.
Yeah.
But we also aren't enclosed subjectivities, and we're modes. And when we agree, we're agreeing in a higher subjectivity, basically, that we're both part of. So anyway.
Because I think structurally, my relationship to my own past might not be any different than my relationship to you. Is each moment of my life history totally self-enclosed and not really bleeding into the next? Or, is there a continuity? And if there's continuity in me, then there must be some degree of continuity between us too.
But then I think the unison of becoming has a sort of community that is a community through separation, right? Like, we're in unison of becoming, but we have unique perspectives, and therefore there's an ethical relation that can't be superseded by assimilation of us.
Yeah, the continuity is never closed, for sure.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah. All right. Glad we worked that out. Josh, your hand's next.
Yeah, this is great. The problem of continuity, I think for me, was one of my original inspirations is the dilemma between continuity and discontinuity. I think this just goes back. It's just a common thread through all of, at least Occidental philosophy, and well, certainly Eastern, in its own way. I'll go back to Simondon because I don't usually get to, like, I'm really in biosemiotics, but nevertheless, I'm really a fan of Simondon. And he says, for example, on the mode of the existence of the technical object, he says, there is no true virtuality in a machine. The machine cannot reform its forms in order to solve a problem. And he says elsewhere that the machine, it doesn't have the notion of a problem. There's no tension in a machine. There's no another term that Simondon uses, at least in translation. There's no disparation. And in my own discipline of biosemiotics, we talk a lot about Lotman. We refer to Lotman's work, and he refers a great deal to this idea of tension, that living organic systems, interpretive systems, meaning-making systems necessarily entail tension. I'm completely sympathetic to Catherine's notion of, bringing emotion, and to Jack bringing up in that context Spinoza, because I think Spinoza also is nicely talking about how it is we can't navigate the individuation, again, to go back to Simondon, this notion that individuation is simultaneously both about the distinction and the intercontinuity simultaneously, and how we resolve that paradox is really what the magic that life has done. And so the final thing I'd like to say is, like, what is that magic? And I think that this is just missing in all the conversations, not necessarily ours. I think this is one of the better conversations, but what's missing is virtuality in the scholastic sense. And what's entailed in virtuality, Peirce talks about his continuum with synechicism. Simondon talks about the metastable pre-individual. Like, all these are tapping into basically infinity, like the infinite degrees of freedom that are necessary, that living systems have to have continuous access to these infinite degrees of freedom in order to continuously not only resolve the tension, but then to regenerate it constantly. And that the machines just categorically have been brilliantly designed not to do this by design. Fundamentally, at the apex of where we are, their accuracy and their binary state is fundamentally to the exclusion of virtuality, and Simondon absolutely understood this. And this one last idea of, like, that Simondon talks about vital individuation is the beings that emerge from vital individuation are simultaneously more and less than themselves. And it's so brilliant, because he talks about this in the sense that we're more than ourselves because we have access to infinite degrees of potential freedom, the virtual, but we're also simultaneously and necessarily less than ourselves. And this is enabling constraints that Kaufman and Longo talk about. We're simultaneously, in order not to just dissipate into wholeness or what have you, we're simultaneously constrained. So we're simultaneously more than less than ourselves. And in any case, machines just fundamentally, as they are today, mechanisms, as Spyridon very nicely outlined in his mathematical talk, if we're limited to these operationalizations as we've inherited them so far, we're just not talking about life yet. So I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. Tim, please.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Josh. Obviously, I'm going to love all the Simondon references. And we're at this point in this conversation where there's just, like, so many things that I would want to respond to, and so many things, so many, potentially fertile branches to explore. To pick up on a few threads really, really quickly, and then bring it back to this, what Matt mentioned earlier about the ethical challenge versus the ontological, work that we're doing. Yes, no true virtuality in a machine. Yeah, Simondon's great on that. It's like so many things in Simondon, we can link it back to Kungi as well. And I had in the lecture yesterday that, the purpose is homogeneous in the machine, right? So he says there's more purpose, in fact, in the machine than in life. But I'd prefer to think of that as it being more homogeneous in a machine, which is exactly the point that you're making and that Simondon makes. There's none of that generative tension, or at least that's the work of concretization for Simondon of a machine is the removal essentially of that tension. Many things to say. I mean, emotion as a bridge. Also, Simondon has very, very rich resources here in terms of the trans-individual dimension, and emotion as a manifestation of that, and precisely, yes, how individuals enter into relations, enter into collectives, and they enter into these relations of internal residence via the pre-individual charge that they as vital individuals maintain within themselves. And that is essentially emotion here. And by this emotional resonance, then you get a collective individuation, another layer of individuation. So not in this sense a collective that pre-exists the individuals, and that somehow they're interpolated into or just enculturated into, but something that is it has its own genesis by virtue of the individuals entering into relation with one another. So much to say in response to all the things that Jack said, for sure. I mean, openness to transformation of tools, absolutely. That's exaptation, and this notion of interlineage exaptation that I was talking about in chemical ecology. Proteins are incredibly prolific, for example. They can stick to all kinds of things. And so moving them from one context to another, they end up doing different things, and you get novel functions, etc. And that's essentially an open-ended process, absolutely, even without sort of mutation per se, or point mutations in the primary structure of the genes that encode those proteins. Constraint is generative, absolutely, Jack, and we don't want to go back into the vulgar hylomorphism we were talking about yesterday by putting those two things as extreme terms, and concealing that generative middle. Yeah, so enabling constraint has been brought up. And also, I think a notion that's quite nice, that's very developed in the free energy principle literature, which helps us to think about ways that we do couple, but without dissolving into each other or without just dissipating into our environments. And that Spinozan point that Jack brought up as well is the notion of sparse coupling. And that's a nice formal notion, but also something that becomes a good, tool for thought. But on the ethical challenge versus the ontological point that Matt brought up, in the discussion surrounding AI. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why I felt that it's important to get clear, I guess, on the ontology of agency. And I think there's a special problem that, a lot of us in this context might have because, biophilosophy, and we might not be vitalists, and we certainly won't admit to it if we are. But there's a lot of generative first or creativity first or variation first kind of ontologies in this space, right? And there might be a tendency there, and this interestingly will dovetail with the what's been mentioned about Mike Levin, but to kind of just make agency fundamental or just completely pervasive, right? Because there's some kind of spontaneity, we might want to say, is fundamental, and isn't spontaneity agency? Or then people might talk about a principle of stationary action, and I know this is something Matt also we've been getting into, and we're going to keep getting into, and look at that as it's a relational principle, it's a context specific thing. So the way a particle, let's say an idealized particle, behaves is a product of its context, etc. And that might seem like agency, and I think we want to be clear, we want to differentiate these things, and there is still something special about living systems. There's something special about vital individuation in Simondon's terms, and it's very related to these things, that fundamental spontaneity, things like principle of stationary action, etc. They show us things about an ontology which does not preclude agency, and in which, in fact, agency can perhaps readily emerge, but they're not in themselves, I would argue, agency in the same way that a living system has agency. And that ontological point may yet become important in this discussion of computational systems, AI systems, etc., and whether they have agency. And then there's a lot to talk about, and we brought it up yesterday with Spyridon a little bit, about some of the formalisms in some of these traditions that we're quite beholden to, cybernetic lineages, for example, which are very, very useful and absolutely are great, to use a Denettian phrase, although he might not be a popular philosopher in this context, intuition pumps, and they are revealing something. Indeed, they're instrumental, utility, their potency in that sense is surely revealing something about the nature of reality. But again, then we want to be very careful about not just conflating things in that space, and not just reading our ontologies off those formalisms simply because they do have that instrumental purchase.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I quickly want to mark a distinction that Whitehead makes that might help us understand agency better. And the conflation of what he would call subjective aim of actual occasions versus what we would maybe want to reserve agency to refer to the agency of living societies of those actual occasions. And so this is like two levels of Whitehead's metaphysics, actual occasions, actual entities. That's a metaphysical category he's developing, whereas societies is more like a cosmological phenomenon, and life at the level of biological organisms is expressing agency in the sense that, and Whitehead would say, there's like a bid for freedom that's occurring where you can't any longer explain the behavior of a living biological organism by reference to its past, whereas in the physical world, the pre-biological world, physics and chemistry, the historical route tells you pretty much all you need to know about what's going to happen next. That's not a sharp division in Whitehead, but I think what he refers to as an actual entity, as a metaphysical category, is something more like, it's not the same as, but something more like the quantum of, or the principles of stationary or released action, where you can think of a photon as like the best empirical example we have of what he was trying to describe as an actual occasion. Though it was meant to apply at all scales, this metaphysical category. But the subjective aim of an actual entity is not the same as the agency of a biological organism. And so that entity society distinction in Whitehead might help us here, maybe, but maybe it makes it worse. I don't know. I don't know if you have a quick reply to that, but
not a quick one. Yeah, let's not go there now. I'm also withholding my whole thing about autopoiesis and all that as well, which has been another topic that's come up. But I don't want to go there because I won't stop if I do. And similarly on the Whitehead thing, I'm not sure. I love Whitehead's scheme, but I'm not sure some of that terminology is helpful. But that could just be me.
Tim Eastman, please.
Yes, and a number of times in this conference, the various kinds of dualities have come up, the whole and the part, the syntactic and semantic with respect to information, the Boolean and non-Boolean, say, in the physics side, the yin and the yang, as Catherine brought out so nicely, various types of dualities, I think, in terms of dualities without dualism, and the synergy there of such contrast, and that's been illustrated in multiple ways. And one thing that strikes me in that I've been exposed to both quantum physics from my science side. I'm a plasma physicist. I've been exposed to process relational philosophy in Whitehead, which one shouldn't think that just reduces to nothing but Whitehead, that is often portrayed, and biosemiotics and semiotics, which I've learned a lot about in the last couple of years. And I'm seeing that there's a tremendous amount of synergy between these three areas, and not enough is done to take advantage of the synergy between these three very productive, rich areas of dialogue. Just a note. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. I mean, I think Untying the Gordian Knot links those and more in a really wonderful way. People should check out your book, and our whole seminar series we did a few years ago about it, helping us connect biosemiotics, process philosophy, quantum physics. Yeah, really important work there. Spyridon, please.
Thank you. I think that we need a distinction between different forms of mechanisms. So, for example, some biologists, and not only, talk of mechanisms in a very, very loose way. So mechanism is another term for something like a causal relation. So without specifying it, without providing quantitative description, for example. And there is also a way to talk about mechanisms in concrete systems theoretical terms. So in this sense, a mechanism is a structure between elements or more elementary entities. And this structure, if it is exerted to particular external conditions, it produces some final results. You know? It has, so to say, an end state directedness. So, but these are two very different usages of the term mechanism, and I think that many people who use these terms don't make clear in what sense do they use that. My suspicion is that Mike Levin uses the term mechanism more in the first sense, something like a general relationship, causal relationship, without using an abstract mathematical descriptions. Maybe he does this, I don't know, I'm not sure. Yes, so this is actually what I wanted to say. I think that this is important reason for misunderstandings, and maybe this is also at the root of this contradiction. Maybe contradiction is too strong between Deacon's and Levin's understandings of computability, of mechanisms, etc. And I agree also that we need a strong concept of agency, by the way.
Mm. Yeah, thank you, Spyridon. I wish we had Mike Levin still here with us to clarify in which sense of mechanism and maybe multiple senses in different contexts.
Well, he is talking about computational processes that are emergent from network structures in any kind of excitable medium. And that's kind of the core of what he's defining as a computational mechanism that gives rise to basal intelligence, as I understand it.
Yeah, that's fair. Thank you, Catherine. Krishna, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this discussion. I wanted to suggest looking to Hegel's philosophy for a conceptual framework that allows or gives some scope for the nuanced continuum between the non-living and the living, from the mechanical through the chemical to the biological and human. This is a talk that was given at a conference that our institute had last year that I mentioned in the comments section that our serving director, Dr. Bimad Vapori, gave, where Hegel gives a nice framework that explains self-other dynamics as a means and the extent to which self can integrate and sustain the integration of its other as a means for conceptualizing the nuances that separate but also kind of unify these 3 or 4 areas in nature. So in mechanism, in the mechanical entities in nature, so throughout mechanical, chemical, biological, and human, the identity of a self is always found in its other. And the capacity to which the self can claim its identity through integrating its other is the capacity to which it is a suitable form of spirit, essentially, right? Because in Hegel's philosophy, nature is spirit in its externality, and the transition from nature to spirit is the human anthropology. And so in mechanism, when we say that the self of a mechanical entity is in its other, what do we mean? So it's the surface of the entity, of the mechanical entity. Let's take a pool ball, right? The surface of a pool ball is determined by the flatness of the table it's intended to roll across, right? Or a gear, the teeth of a gear are such, they're determined by the way they're supposed to interlock with other gears. So in this way, the self of a mechanical entity is determined by its other. But with mechanical entities, when they come in contact with another, they simply collide. There's no deeper sense of integration that becomes clearer what we mean by a deeper sense of integration, chemical, biological, and human. They simply, the surfaces collide, and that's it. So the significance of why that's a less significant degree of embodiment of spirit becomes clear when we look at the chemical entity. Now, chemicals are they're polar, right? There's polarity, there's attraction between chemicals. So in mechanical bodies also, external, there has to be external agency that brings those bodies together, gravity, an external force. There's no internal impetus for the mechanical bodies to come together. Now that starts to transition into chemical bodies when we get to magnetism, right? Because there are mechanical objects that are magnetic, and chemicals are inherently polar, they're magnetic. That's a form of magnetism. So when chemical entities come together, they don't just collide, right? They react. There's a chemical transformation. But the product of the chemical reaction remains unstable. It continues to react with other chemicals. It doesn't form. So for instance, when hydrogen and oxygen react, they form water, which is a pretty stable product, but still it can react with a gas, methane, and form methane crystals in the ocean. So the product of chemical reactions, although it's a more significant unity than we find with mechanical entities, still it doesn't reach like a sustained unity. It's always open to further drastic reaction where it can completely become something else. So in biological entities, we find that it's a more sustained unity, because when two biological entities come together, basically it's predation, right? One organism will eat the other organism. But instead of transforming, like when oxygen and hydrogen come together, they're both gases and they become a liquid, water, right? But when a biological entity encounters another biological entity, a bear and a salmon, or a bear and a blueberry bush, they don't transform into something new. Rather, the bear integrates its other into itself, right? Even though the salmon and the blueberry bush are distinct entities, in the biological process, they are disintegrated and reintegrated into the being of the bear. And so that's a more lasting unity, right? Because the bear doesn't radically transform like in chemical reactions. And so following this train of thought, as we developed it during the conference last year, we're still working on fleshing this out. So with the human, so the way that the biological unity becomes disturbed is during reproduction, where the biological entity now, it can't integrate its other in the same way it does during consumption when it comes to reproduction. Rather, its other has to remain outside of itself for reproduction to work. So that unity where it integrates other into itself is disrupted in that way. And so now that leaves, the necessity for how does a human, how is it superior to biological entities in this logic that we're trying to keep here? Well, the unity with its other becomes something that occurs in thought. So up until this point, the unity with other required basically the annihilation of the other in its previous form. But in the human's elevated capacity for thought, the other doesn't have to be annihilated to be integrated into the human. And also, so based on the whole reproduction line of thought, there is a capacity for love, a loving exchange, where it's not just an animalistic reproductive exchange, rather there's love and affection and emotional unity that overcomes the animalistic aggression that's involved in reproduction. So anyhow, so I'm just suggesting that Hegel's philosophy be something that we turn to consider this biophilosophy. Even the Hegel Bulletin from the Great Britain Hegel Society, they published a special issue back in 2020, volume 41, special issue 3, specifically about Hegel's philosophy of biology. The Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute's conference for this year, which we're planning for December, we're going to try to focus on this topic. And anyhow, so I'm just mentioning these things here. I think it's an appropriate place to mention them, and any other thoughts about them, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Krishna, for bringing Hegel into this conversation. I totally agree. Super relevant for any biophilosophy. And yeah, how you've laid his system out really, I thought was extremely helpful and integrative for me. I mean, I have a new way of understanding the master-slave dialectic as overcoming that animal instinct to assimilate through this love, mutual recognition. So yeah, lots to think about there. And I don't know if Yana is still here. She was asking me privately about Schelling's idea of ideative assimilation yesterday, which sounds similar. There's Yana. I don't know if you were feeling any sense of resonance with what Krishna was just saying and how Schelling understands human thought and how we overcome the reproductive disruption and are able to assimilate the other via thought. I don't know if that rang any bells for you, but
No, as I told you, I know Schelling only secondhandly. As one of my colleagues contributed to the book I showed you during my presentation on Schelling, I actually realized it's very relevant and underestimated philosopher, I think. So I'm really glad that there will be this conference you are going to, and a lot of I mean, maybe he's going to be revived, right? But I cannot add anything like particularly
we need more
relevant.
Schelling and we need more Hegel for sure.
But the chapter, I thought that the idea of ideative assimilation was concerning organisms as well.
Sure.
And yeah, but it's not like that. You think he only referred to humans?
I think in System of Transcendental Idealism, yeah, which Hegel is indebted to Schelling, obviously, and develops some of the ideas in System of Transcendental Idealism and the phenomenology of spirit, and then on into the encyclopedia. But I think Schelling probably meant it only for human beings. In the ideative assimilation sense, maybe there's an organic assimilation that would be analogous, but not the same. So okay, thanks again, Krishna, for bringing Hegel in. Parham, you're next.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to, I know Farzad mentioned confabulation, and also going back to Josh's point about sort of balancing the sort of endless potential space with the more constrained space, and the relationship between those two modes of being. And kind of reminded me of Ian McGilchrist's work and some of the discussions we had at the last year's conference. I mean, he talks about sort of the left hemisphere as being like the virtual, the simulated mode of knowing, and the right hemisphere as being more organic, more flow-based. And he talks about that more deeply in the context of the union of the opposites, and that the fact that there's a sweet spot between flow and form, between this sort of more discursive mode of knowing and this more creative potential based mode of knowing. So I just wanted to bring our attention. I think we need more McGilchrist too when it comes to these discussions and our relationship with technology nowadays. I think the fact that the nature has come up with this sort of harmonious relationship between these two different modes of being and knowing could be relevant for us.
Can I speak to that? I don't have the option of raising my hand, but I just wanted to say Ian McGilchrist is wonderful in parsing sort of these two different ways of knowing with the hemispheric lateralization of the brain, which I think is a very important distinction. But one of the things that I had to cut out of my talk was that when we talk about conscious versus unconscious, our brain is literally dipping in and out of all of the variety of brain waves all day long, right? We got gamma, beta, alpha, theta, delta, which are the lowest ones, of course, are associated with sleep or imagination, internal meditation, stuff like that. But that's a beautiful way of looking at it, thinking about it, because our brains are dipping into all of those all day long. Just because we're hanging out up here and our consciousness is hanging out up here, the whole rest of the body is dipping in and out of its level of regulatory communication through the cognitive glue, if you will. And there's been a really interesting bunch of, actually, the theta wave has been associated with emotion, which is, of course, in sleep mode, but that the whole idea of this res potentia and res extensa, in our experience of it, the unconscious and the dreaming is over here, and it is part of our experience. It's part of where our organism goes at night to process information. And if anybody's ever had prescient dreams or anything like that, those are all really interesting questions to think about. But in psychiatry, there have been identifications in certain psychiatric problems like schizophrenia, where there's a disconnect between the gamma wave, which is our focus out here, and the theta wave, which is emotion. And that, I think that's a really important bit of science to take into consideration with any of these mechanisms that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine and Parham. Of course, we had our Ian McGilchrist conference last year that the Center for Process Studies and CIS hosted, which all the talks are up and available for those who want to see that intersection happen. Tim, please.
I just wanted to add, I loved what Catherine just said, but I wanted to speak to what Spyridon was saying again about the use of the term mechanism and the vagueness in its deployment. And I think also Catherine did do a pretty good job of clarifying part of Mike Levin's use there. But I think we also need to just recognize a difference between a mechanism and a kind of general principle or something like that. So people often talk about natural selection being a mechanism. Natural selection is not a mechanism. Natural selection is a principle. There are mechanisms of selection, but natural selection per se is not a mechanism. I work in chemical ecology, right? So toxicity is not a mechanism. Like antagonizing nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, that's a mechanism, right? So to me, a mechanism is something that, aside also from the systems biology use and the computational use, and as you said, Spyridon, a connection there with a kind of abstract mathematical representation of a mechanism. To me, I think about mechanisms in very concrete terms. So again, as you said, Spyridon, in terms of a structure between elements, but to characterize a mechanism is to really characterize those elements and the way they are interacting and coupling and the effects that has and all of that. I think people often think natural selection is a mechanism because they think it's an algorithm, right? And natural selection per se, as one part of the sort of what I call the Darwin, Purcell, Wanton triad, which is variation, selection, and inheritance, natural selection per se can't really be an algorithm there. The whole thing also, I'm not sure if you could call it an algorithm, at least because it's founded on this generative firstness of variation. So there's always something new coming into the process at every iteration, if you did want to think about it in an iterative term. So I think, yeah, there are a lot of confusions there. Is it a mechanism because it's an algorithm? Is it an algorithm at all? But I would just use the term mechanism in biology in a very specific and concrete manner. We characterize mechanisms, not just in a hand wavy way using that term. And I think that will be perhaps a useful distinction to make. And then we can also get out of this. Again, this is something that I harp on all the time, and Matt knows this. But is Darwin a mechanistic thinker? Is that or has he been appropriated in some sense by the so-called mechanical philosophy? And maybe he was relatively happy with that appropriation, but I would say there aren't really mechanisms in Darwin. Like if you read Darwin himself, he's a principled thinker. There's a lot of description, like a huge amount of description of empirical details, but is he really characterizing mechanisms in general? I don't think that's particularly what he did a great deal of.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Hopefully we can come back around to the question of this triad, variation, selection, inheritance, and think through the origin of form, biological form in particular. But I want to hear what Josh has to say first.
Yeah, actually, this is great. I raised my hand again, kind of in response to Timothy, because I have to admit, I do sort of characterize, perhaps incorrectly or too simplistically, received Darwinism, not Darwin per se, because I think you make a really nice distinction there. As kind of, as I said yesterday, degenerate modes of evolution from a Peircean perspective. And that I think Darwin was quite clear what he was doing, and just as you nicely characterized. And in addition, Darwin didn't claim to be explaining life. Like he presupposed life and then was describing very, very powerful ideas, principles having to do with that. In the context, however, of making a distinction between whatever it is we want to call mechanism or not, and life, I do think there is a distinction to be made, which I think a lot of us here agree with that. I want to come back to other triads having to do with, the virtual, the actual, and the habitual, digging back into the scholastics again, on up through Simondon and Peirce. That, again, I think that we're missing, not we, like this group necessarily, but the larger conversation about what is life and what is meaning making. I think, again, we're missing this idea of generativity, a vital generativity, like in the Simondonian sense of how it is novel dimensions are generated intrinsically for the system itself, not just stochastically, and certainly not mechanistically. In the algorithmic sense, but that there's kind of a third mode, if you will, or a third ingredient of generativity that Peirce might call positive sympathy, and Simondon might refer to as internal resonance. That there's kind of these preferences that emerge via individuation. So that's a non-trivial conversation, that we won't necessarily have today, but that there is this third aspect that does, again, dip into the virtual, has a very particular relationship to these infinite degrees of freedom. And it's really interesting. One final thing I'll say about this is that it's interesting, Turing's genius is that he understood that infinity was necessary. Like his, the gold standard for a Turing machine is an infinite tape. But for him, it's a countable infinity. Nevertheless, I think Peirce definitely explicitly talked about Cantor. Cantor's continuous infinity, making a distinction between different kinds of infinity. And you need this kind of infinity as ways of when the living systems problematize themselves, which mechanisms by definition do not do. In fact, if it does, then we consider it broken. That life has amazingly figured out a way that simultaneously problematize itself and have these degrees of freedom that are forever available to then generate ever novel complexities and solutions to their own problem. And so again, I just want to re-bring up what I think is a pretty hard line between whatever it is we want to characterize as a received inherited mechanism versus a living system.
Yeah, I have somewhere I could take us with another question, but I wonder if anyone who hasn't spoken yet wants to chime in, since there are no hands up currently.
I've spoken too much, but I just would say to Josh again that, yeah, that virtual, actual, habitual, scholastic triad, of course, is the same essentially triad that we find in Darwin, and Peirce recognizes that, and he does that mapping in A Guess at the Riddle. So there's, very nice resonance there. And I think of that, what you're gesturing towards there, this relationship between, I guess, the habitual and dipping back into the virtual, so to speak, in terms of a counter-effectuation in Deleuzian terms, or like a structuration of the virtual that exists in virtue of just a pre-existent structure in some sense, right? So there is that, in Peircean terms, the genesis of the novel interpretant with its particular structure then already is in a relationship with like the adjacent possible, right? To use that lovely term. The adjacent possible then, as distinct from the virtual in the sort of generic sense, and this would be the Deleuzian distinction between the virtual and the possible, actually, is the structured virtuality that has a kind of quasi-definiteness to it because of its adjacency to an actual occasion, essentially, right? Or an actual situation. So it's reachable from here, right? It's adjacent.
Yeah, one thing, if you guys don't mind, I'll just add is the beauty of, and I think Deacon certainly understands the power of constraint. I think that it speaks exactly what you're saying, Tim, like the idea that constraint doesn't necessarily say what does happen, but it definitely says what does not happen. And that this then gives us the both and to manage the infinities in a way that could move towards a positive sympathy. So it's not just stochastic. We're not just wandering around in the dark, which Kaufman understood, life is non-ergodic. It has a preference. There's a preference, which isn't necessarily a priori a teleology in the sense that there's a presupposed end, but there's an aiming, so to speak, a line of flight in the Deleuzian sense.
Aiming is a word I like because it's very Whiteheadian. And so I guess what's coming to the surface for me and hearing you and Tim go back and forth about this is whether biological agency or biological autonomy can be understood as something that emerges out of undirected variation and constraint or secondness of some kind, selection. Or do we have to go with Whitehead and say, well, variation itself is already tilted, not by some external imposition of purpose, but by its very nature? I mean, Whitehead has a God concept, but for him, all that God means is that possibility has an aim. And I think in some of Peirce's theological speculations, he makes thirdness first, in this sense that there's already a tilt in variation. It's not just random. And so I wonder, when we think about biological agency, whether we need to presuppose that kind of a cosmic eros or aim in a Whiteheadian or Peircean sense, an agapistic principle, or if we can get biological agency, biological form, all the stuff we want when we talk about life out of undirected variation and constraint. Right? I think that's a key fulcrum point for me, at least, because I would go with Whitehead, as Tim knows.
I think wherever, to Josh's point though as well, wherever you have constraint, and actually that just means wherever you have some actual situation, you have biasing of that, possibility landscape already.
But is that an explanation of thirdness as a combination of firstness and secondness, or is there more to that synthesis that suggests that thirdness is equiprimordial with firstness and secondness?
Well, I think you bring up explanation. I think making a particular thirdness, like a contentful thirdness, primordial is
Yeah, for
putting a
sure.
block in the path of inquiry in Peircean terms, right? So that makes explanation impossible, like explanation of that primordial thirdness, as opposed to the propensity or capacity for thirds to emerge, the existence of a particular thirdness as eternal or whatever, is saying this is something you can't get behind. Like this is a habit of the cosmos, which is an unexplained explainer in my terms. And I just would want to avoid that, because I just want to say that we're encountering a limit here, and we kind of don't need to go. We just acknowledge the limit in some sense there. So I would say, like I said in the talk yesterday, like I don't think we have the hope of complete explanations here. I think as soon as you put variation or generativity or spontaneity or whatever, like down in the bottom or in the base of your scheme, so to speak, you are giving up that possibility of complete explanation or indeed closure of your system. And I don't think we should seek closure to our systems just for the sake of like internal coherence or something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is where Whitehead says what is metaphysically contingent, namely God as the first accident of creativity, it can nonetheless be categorically necessary. So that it's the primordial nature of God, or the envisagement of eternal objects or possibilities without a history, isn't a particular habit or a particular imposition of form, but a shaping of a tilting of the space of form, that's then inherited by all subsequent occasions.
Yeah, and I think where we've got to that is that if you strip away, you and I have got to in many of our discussions, if we strip away some of the terminology and just be purely diagrammatic, in God is just the first actual entity. Obviously, I have an issue then with how sort of profligate this infinity of pre-definite eternal objects is. So there are lots of little nuances that you and I are probably never going to agree on there, but that's okay. Like it's good for us to have that generative tension. Just to go back to Josh as well, and the reference of ergodicity and living systems, and really evolution in general not being ergodic. This is where also there is a problematic relationship with infinities in actually a lot of the formal approaches which Turing is inheriting. Formal approaches which go back to Laplace and Bernoulli, like architects of probability theory, and into statistical mechanics and blah blah blah. Ergodicity is what I call a tacit infinity, right? It's like given the fullness of time, the system will visit every state of the predefined state space, right? With equal likelihood, given the fullness of time. So there's a way of projecting things onto infinities that I think we also want to avoid. And indeed, by putting a bias into an exploration of a state space, but also letting that state space continually transform, with us saying, we can't get everywhere from here. Thus, we are problematizing a particular notion of infinity anyway.
I think just if I could add one thing to resolve some of these things that I think you guys are talking about is to make the claim that, say, for example, firstness, secondness, and thirdness in the Peircean sense are irreducible to each other, and that they're coextensive. In other words, to your point, Timothy, about like we can't really explain anything before firstness, secondness, and thirdness, but we need them, the three of them, to be simultaneously interdependent and distinct. This is Peirce, and I think it helps resolve some of these issues. And I think it's one of the first things that people get wrong when in a systems theoretic context, when we start putting one prior to the other, as it puts you in a position of having to explain each in terms of the other, which I think will sort of kill your project.
That's a big one. I mean, I think just to really quickly respond to that, because this is something Matt and I also go over all the time, I think there is a sense, of course, that in medias res, all those three aspects of the triune real are always present. You can take that stance towards anything you encounter in any corner of the three universes, as Peirce will say. But there's also an ordinality to the scheme, which I think is also worth thinking about again in a principled way. And so again, I bring that back to Darwin as a fulcrum, and the epistemological, because he's not doing ontology really at all, the epistemological firstness of variation. And then again, in any of these sort of generative schemes, and I think this applies to Whitehead as well, with his creativity first, and then the absolutely irrational origin of the primordial nature and all of that, there is a sense in which if that creativity, and again, I think there are reasons to resist the term creativity at precisely this point, but we won't go there. That creativity then is a firstness, which is genuinely first, right? So there is something, if we want to think Genesis to its limit. So I think Jack said, and I completely agree, that the key problematic for biophilosophy is Genesis, ontogenesis, ontophylogenesis, in the terms of Jean-Jacques Copiac. Then it is important, again, not as a way of trying to close the system and trying to think determinate origins, but to think to the limit of that process. So you'd be thinking something like cosmogenesis there, and obviously people like Peirce and Whitehead were very willing to go there, and even Simondon in the conclusion to Individuation book finally goes there, and he's like, you may accuse me of a creationist hypothesis, but this is why I'm different from that. But if we are thinking that very limit of some kind of quote unquote absolute origin, then this ordinality of the firstness, secondness, and thirdness is gonna reappear. And that was a very, as we know, like a problematic issue for Peirce himself. He tried to propose, initially describe a cosmogenic event of firstness first. And I mean, he's got some really beautiful writing on that. But then he was critiqued by a contemporary whose name I can never remember, who was like, hang on, you're already presupposing in your scheme the existence of, if not determinate thirds, the capacity for thirds to emerge. So the capacity for habit taking has to be there from the beginning in some sense. And Peirce is like, oh, you're absolutely right. And then, of course, Peirce takes a more and more explicitly theological turn in the later parts of his life. So I think there's still I would just sit with that tension in some sense, like there is a 1, 2, 3, there is like a sequence here. But at the same time, as soon as there's anything, they're all there.
Yeah.
Make a comment about what you're speaking about specifically. I know I'm not in order here, but
If it's quick,
I have a comment. Yeah,
sure.
We'll be quick. So the question of, is there a non-dogmatic way to think of divinity as a first cause? So in nature, we observe biogenesis, life coming from life. You can call it, in terms of self-organization, you can call it other-caused self-organization, because you need a parent, which gives rise to a process of the self-organization of a new individual. But that is a negative regress if you follow that pattern all the way back. Eventually, because it relies on an other to produce it, there has to be an origin, which is not other-caused, but self-caused. That's what Spinoza called causa sui. Right? So for the necessity of divinity as a self-caused, self-organizing original principle that gives rise to the sequence of biogenesis that we see in nature. I just wanted to throw that out there, and how it relates to this firstness, secondness, and thirdness of Peirce. Well, so Peirce was inspired in many ways by Hegel, and the general, although Hegel didn't use these words himself, the general system of his dialectic unfolding was, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So firstness, secondness, thirdness would be connected to that divine original principle as the dialectic structure through which spirit comes to know itself. And so I don't know if this is very vague the way I'm putting it. I don't have the capacity to elaborate on it now, but I just wanted to throw those thoughts in the ring.
Yeah, thanks, Krishna. it's interesting that, the Hegel and Schelling friendship and then conflict, I think, plays into Peirce, who inherits, I think, Schelling probably more than Hegel. Where Peirce even says I guess at the Riddle, one of his essays, that Hegel has committed the trifling oversight of forgetting that there is a real world with real actions and reactions, rather a serious oversight that, which, Hegel's whole logic is based on negation, so you would think he would get secondness, but I think Peirce seems to have a preference for objective idealism if he's an idealist, rather than a kind of, I guess he's perceiving Hegel as resolving everything into mind or spirit in the end, and Peirce is trying to resist that a bit. But yeah, I take your point about there are certainly, I think, rational arguments for God as an origin. It's just a question of whether they're adequate to our empirical understanding of nature. And that debate has been raging for millennia. Farzad, please.
Oh God. So great place to step in. I was just going to remark, just a side remark, as you were talking about with Tim, the primordial nature of God and Whitehead, or God as the original actual entity, all that is so consistent with Ibn Sina's necessary existent. And in that system, you have the beauty and the luxury of not needing a creation. It just is done. And then all of the Platonic stuff that rolls out of a primordial nature and all of the contingencies that become necessary afterwards, kind of very much like Whitehead. I've got to get that draft together someday and print that. But anyway, that's not what I was going to bring up. I was going to kind of take into account that business that machines can't problematize themselves, what Josh was saying about Simondon. I have to agree with that. Which is kind of contrary to what I was saying about that line between realization and simulation kind of getting vaguer and vaguer. But in our interaction with artificial intelligence and large language models, I think that that's a good distinction. I don't think it'll problematize itself, probably not. But just for a moment to play with the LLM idea again as sort of a stacked deck of adjacent possibles that are already cognitive because they're products of human culture. So it is really a mirror in that sense. I just want to bring up, this is anecdotal, but what the hell? I think it opens up the range of creativity a lot for us, which means good things, bad things, of course. But specifically, I had my students use large language model of their choosing to feed their first paragraph in as a prompt and see how it would write the paper as opposed to how they did write the paper. And the idea is that they're supposed to write it first and then check it against what the AI would say. And so I used Whitehead in one of these courses. In any case, the LLM came up with this really off interpretation of the principle of modification, which it totally made up. But then it applied it to the history of science. And I thought, that's an interesting way to look at the history of science. Hasok Chang bringing back phlogiston in a different context now than in the 60s and rerunning that history again. This is an interesting sort of way to go. It came out of this, basically the 2-3 sentences about this in the AI's output got me to consider using principle of modification differently, completely out of the context where Whitehead brought it up in terms of electron in the body, electron outside the body, that whole fun trip that he plays there, which is really that layers of constraint business that Whitehead's playing out. But playing it out epistemologically, I hadn't thought of that. That was fun. Maybe there's some more to it there. And what I was saying before about experimenting with the histories of what the classicists have created for us, both in our commentary tradition and in the commentary traditions of Islamic philosophy and scholastic philosophy and all the rest. There's a large fictional element to all of those commentaries. They're commenting on people who are ancient to them. They're commenting on Plato and Aristotle, who are, dead 1,000 years or more. And so we inherit that. And so we're continuing this confabulation. But we can bring evidence to the fore and do count of, basically we can do some empirical work with these LLMs and maybe come up with different stories. I think all of this, despite what sounded scary before, I think the excesses of large language models do reflect our own excesses. And so it becomes a rational proposition to consider them as dialogue partners as we go ahead. And I know that's not generally how it's being used. It's being used commercially in a lot of different ways, surveillance capitalism and the rest. And there's AIs that are already making money. They're investing in the stock market. They're amassing their own fortunes. And they're also capable of using several different pieces of software together to act as agents. All that's happening. But what I'm talking about is just purely in our own little circle of intellectual adventure and research. I think it acts as an accelerator of what we're doing and not so much taking a crap in the punch as it sounded like I was saying before. So anyway, just considering that, I think it could be a stimulus to human evolution more rapidly if taken on that positive note as a sort of an abduction mirror for us. And I'm wondering how well that plays, or there's got to be some flaw in what I'm saying. Love to hear, love to hear that. But anyway.
Oops, I was muted. Just real quick, the Avicenna-Whitehead connection obviously makes me think of the footnotes to Plato, how the Western Islamic traditions share that common source. And there's so much Neoplatonism coming through in Whitehead with some important twists. But on LLMs, I mean, I also think with Plato that we should take a sort of a critical but also participatory perspective, like the same way that he related to the alphabet. This is dangerous, he was saying, but I'm going to use it really well to convey my ideas to you. And the way that the alphabet changes, I mean, Terry Deacon's work on language and how it changed the brain, the way, I mean, there are alphabetic languages and character-based languages, and they change the brain in different ways. LLMs are going to be changing maybe already are changing our brains in fundamental ways and affecting human evolution in a way that's not exactly continuous with the development of speech and then writing and then phonetic alphabets. There are breaks, there are emergent, major evolutionary, at least cultural evolutionary transitions with each of these technologies. And LLMs are certainly going to continue that sort of coevolution of human beings in their languages. Yeah.
Just sorry,
go ahead.
Just to amplify this point really quickly with another Simondonism, Simondon says, obviously, technicity must never be considered an isolated reality, but part of a system. Being the result of an evolution, technicity is also the depository of a capacity to evolve. And so, we could bring someone like Alfred Korzybski into the conversation as well, and just the notion of like cultural time fixing or whatever. But I think the points that you guys are making are very well taken there. I mean, tools change us, obviously. And these tools are very, very powerful tools. And there is like a principle of garbage in, garbage out. Like you can have a pretty good conversation with an LLM, or you can, not. And that will partly be a result of the quality of the prompts that you give it, and even your, I find you have to constantly correct them, and like, for example, if you want to use them as an interlocutor for developing, any of these kinds of ideas, you want to keep telling them to be critical, because otherwise they're just going to be like, oh, you're such a genius.
They trick out,
because they're products that are designed to make us continue engaging with them, right? And they're very well designed in that regard as well. But if you keep engineering the prompt, then you can have a half decent conversation. But yeah, they are, of course, a very potent tool for the way they are feeding back on us, and that is, it's overused term, but their promise and their peril, right? They are pharmacon in this sense, and so we just have to be careful about that, as well as recognizing the potential benefits.
Yeah, we're so fixated on how the LLMs hallucinate that we're forgetting that we're hallucinating about the LLMs very frequently.
Exactly.
So we're coming towards the end here. Parham, I want to invite you to share whatever you'd like. But just to note that we're gonna wrap up soon.
Sure. I'll be quick. Just going back to Sir Peirce, for my reading, like he didn't think that natural selection was enough, and he saw natural selection as sort of being stuck in this secondness, and he thought there needs to be this sort of thirdness, this meta habit of habit generation for this process to complexify and be generative. And I just wanted to quickly mention that Terence Deacon is working on this concept called inverse Darwinism, which is basically a complement to neo-Darwinistic views. And he sees it as this sort of during the times of surplus and when the organism can afford to create redundancies, these sort of degradations can accumulate and create the possibility of synergy to arise. So there's this kind of priming of exaptation and synergy and novelty that organisms participate in, and it's the other mode of evolution. So if you're interested in sort of more modern view of how Deacon and Peirce would have approached this other mode of thirdness in biology, I encourage you to look into inverse Darwinism.
There's a huge and great conversation on evolution of evolvability that is really relevant to this context, but I mean has been a big story in biology in the last few decades. I just note again, and not that everything is Darwin to me, but you know, Darwin actually does talk about redundancy in On the Origin of Species, and how that could be. He doesn't use the term evolvability, obviously, but how that could be a source of evolvability. A lot of my work has been on various forms of neo-functionalization at the molecular level, particularly with gene families that encode toxins, and so redundancy is a huge factor there. So redundancy, degeneracy, these things that you're referencing there are absolutely crucial, and also, you know, there are other neglected sort of biophilosophers / biologists, people like Conrad Howell Waddington, obviously influenced by Whitehead, Richard Goldschmidt. You know, this idea, and again, this can be brought into such productive dialogue with people like Raymond Rouillère and Gilbert Simondon, some of the people we've been talking about. But you know, so obviously Waddington's epigenetic landscape, but the capacity of an organism to accumulate neutral variation, so essentially phenotypically and like fitness-wise neutral variation, which can bring it to a certain place where I talked in my talk about individuation as elicitation, but where it is primed for the, you know, elicitation of a novel individuation event, because it has all of these, let's say, you know, resources of latent variation to draw upon. And that's, you know, that's the essential idea of Waddington's epigenetic landscape and genetic assimilation. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I agree. Actually, Deacon draws on Waddington as well, so that's definitely resonant there.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I think we should draw our time to a close here. Put a boundary around something that at least temporarily we'll need to take a break from, but this is an ongoing conversation, and I think hopefully some of you can join us, whether online or in person, at the International Whitehead Conference next summer in Carbondale, Illinois, where Randall Oxier will be hosting this conference in the Center for Process Studies, and we will have our session there on biophilosophy and just really, you know, try to continue to work through these ideas. I think this was a wonderful entryway, and really just laying out a feast. I'm sure we could have continued for another several hours here without a hiccup if I let you, but I'm not going to do that. We're going to have to wrap it up. Spyridon, did you want to offer any final reflections or thoughts? You're muted, but maybe you don't have anything.
It's honestly, it's very late here. And so I want to say to express my thankfulness to everybody who came here who talked about all these very essential issues, and I hope that we will continue this discussion. You said already that we will meet again in 1 year.
Yeah.
In June or July 2026.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Spyridon. And thank you all. Thank you, Andrew, for helping all the help from the Center for Process Studies to make this happen. And we'll be in touch. And we're going to be sharing the videos of your talks. And we'll have transcripts of the talks too, and we can talk about how to present what we've the ideas that we shared collectively to a public audience as we move forward. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.